Welcome to CXOTalk, episode 859. I'm Michael Krigsman, and we're discussing AI ethics with Dr. Scott Zoldi, the Chief Analytics Officer of FICO. You've probably heard of the FICO credit score that's used everywhere. That's them. Scott has profound experience leading data science and AI research efforts. He has over 130 patents either pending or granted, and this is his second appearance on CXOTalk.
One of my roles, at FICO is to drive our strategy from an AI and machine learning perspective and analytics perspective into how we develop models and products and solutions for our customers. And so, part of what I do is focus on really what is the cutting edge of what we need to do from an AI and machine learning perspective to meet today's demands.
Give us a sense of how AI is being used in financial services, and then we can drill into these very challenging issues around ethics and so on.
Financial services companies have been using AI for a very long time. In fact, we at FICO got some of our starts with AI and machine learning in the year 1992 with the introduction of Falcon, which was and continues to be a leading fraud solution, which looks at streaming transaction data, payment data, and makes assertions whether or not what the probability of fraud would be associated with a transaction. And so if you go from 1992 to today, we see that just broader sort of applications of AI and machine learning across enterprise, mostly driven by this sort of broader sort of ability to get access to AI and machine learning. More and varied sort of data sources and sort of this sort of digital revolution where data is more and more available. And really, people are looking at using AI and machine learning as that tool to make sense of it all. And so you can see it from, financial crime to decisions in credit risk, financial inclusion, customer journey. I think there's not really many areas of the financial services business where AI and machine learning isn't being explored today.
The nature of the way that AI is being used, is it primarily to drive efficiency, or does AI support more fundamental or transformative changes?
Many of our customers still driving the more transformative aspects. And so, to give an example, many are looking at how do I improve financial inclusion by bringing in new types of data, for example, open finance data. And so, they're looking for capabilities they don't have today and or to bring in different types of data and use machine learning to incorporate that to improve detection and to reach out to more customers and to be, more effective in their business. Certainly with things like generative AI, there are also those efficiency plays that people are looking at in terms of making their internal staff more efficient. But, I still see more on the transformation side. For many, this concept of being able to use an analytic AI platform and make decisions using AI and machine learning models is really a game changer for many of them to rethink how they solve these problems.
You made an interesting comment. You described the use of Gen AI as being more on the efficiency side. Is that basically how you see it?
I think it's related to our topic today, frankly, because, there's a lot less control around generative AI and whether or not you can explain it, interpret it. There are concerns around ethics. And so, very often generative AI is, viewed as a powerful tool, and it is. But usually used internally right now, so that you have more checks and controls. You have a human in the loop that if it's valuable, then they use it. If it's not valuable, they don't use it. Versus the transformation sort of aspects of AI, they're directly informing decisions that impact people, and that's where there's this higher level of scrutiny in traditional AI around ethics and responsibility. So I think it's more of a life cycle. Eventually, generative AI or the next variants of what that looks like will get there, but they're not there today.
When we talk about AI ethics or responsible AI in financial services, can you describe broadly the set of issues? What are the issues, and why is this so challenging?
Why do people want to use AI and machine learning? People want to use AI and machine learning because you can bring in lots of disparate digital data. You can ask that machine to find relationships in data that a human being would not be able to understand. And you can ask that machine learning model or train it to produce a score. So take all that tremendous complexity, right, and hit a button, and it creates this sort of machine learning model that, if you tested it, would do a good job, let's say, predicting who would default on a loan or who would commit fraud. The challenge is that almost all machine learning models are not interpretable, meaning that even though it can do that task, being able to explain to somebody how it made that decision is a very, very hard thing in many, and sometimes impossible in many types of machine learning models. And so, one of the biggest sort of challenges we have is we know these are powerful tools, but depending on the type of algorithm you choose, you won't be able to explain it. You may not be able to demonstrate that it's ethical other than doing lots of testing post hoc. And so, this is the challenge, is that, we have that power to maybe make that transformation, but we want to do it in a responsible, careful way. And, for us at FICO and for many that are focused on responsible AI, that means really, very, very specific conversations and around process, but also, around algorithm selection. You shall use this and you cannot use that in terms of the right types of algorithms that would make it easier to interpret those what it's learning and making sure that it's safe to use.
Is the fundamental issue the black box nature of how the decisions are made using machine learning and AI?
Correct. And many organizations will look at explainable AI and they'll say, oh, well, we'll just apply Shapley methods on top and it'll be just fine. Well, that doesn't meet regulatory scrutiny in many parts of the world in terms of, being a sufficient way to explain an outcome to an individual. And so, I think, we have the black box nature. And then, frankly, we also have people that, need to dive a little deeper, right, in terms of, okay, how will we get that level of explainability? And, are the methods that are out there today actually sufficient when it comes to a high risk or a high stakes decision made with machine learning?
So you have the black box aspect of it, and we'll definitely need to talk further about that. But you also have questions around the data, because even if that black box is fully explainable, if there are issues with the source data, then you can have inherent bias built into the results.
It's a really interesting thing that many people don't spend time on, right? And it always drives me a little crazy, right? The fact that we can, load data into a cloud compute and spin a Python algorithm or a notebook and generate a model in an hour and say, yeah, look, it took us, only a couple hours to generate a model. Let's deploy it. Well, we haven't gone through any of the necessary steps necessarily to really study that data, ensure that it's balanced, right? That we have proper representation of the individuals that we're going to use this model to make decisions about. And moreover, right, data's dirty. In fact, a lot of people talk about data as an asset, and I may have said this before on the previous one, but I look at data as a liability, right? I mean, we should really be very suspect about the data that we collect. And that includes, yes, do we have the right data? Is it representative of everyone that we're trying to score on? Is it balanced from an ethics or bias perspective? And then moreover, something that people don't focus on very much is, do I have the right outcome data, right? And there are a lot of examples out there where people are not careful in how they, collect that data, and they actually don't have the right tags or the right outcomes. And so even when they train the model, right, it's already kind of dirty from the get-go. So to your point, if you're not spending the time up front really interrogating that data and making some hard decisions, then it doesn't really matter how good your models are down the stream. You've already poisoned the broth.
Subscribe to our newsletter. Go to CXOTalk.com to check out our upcoming shows. We have extraordinary shows coming up. We're planning a whole series around AI ethics, so tell your friends and tell your family. We have some comments and questions coming in from Twitter, so let's jump over there. And this first one is from Arsalan Khan, who says, can AI determine what is ethical versus moral? That's an interesting question of itself. It's like, what is, ethical versus moral? Who decides what is what? And wouldn't one's profit-seeking attitude get in the way of ethics and morals?
AI is neither good or bad, right? And it's just an algorithm, right? It's looking for ways to solve a problem. And so, that's where a human needs to be in the loop, right? And because if I ask an AI model to solve a task, it might find, differences between gender or race or ethnicity or nationality and grab a hold of that to make a better model and a better prediction. Doesn't mean that it's right or wrong, right? But it means that a human being needs to then go and make those determinations of what is right and wrong. Which brings me to maybe the second part of that question around, profit, seeking and the fact that, many people that build AI are businesses and they want to drive profit. This is where we need to have a model development standard, an ethics standard, right? And so, we don't want decisions to be made around ethical use or what is ethical only after we've, built the model and we've decided that, this decision could impact profit. We have to define all that up front. And so, the companies that don't have those moral dilemmas when they look at what the AI has learned are the companies that simply say, okay, this is what it means to us to build ethical AI models. These are the tests that we're going to do. And if these tests get violated, we're going to not allow those relationships that were learned by the AI until it's a respin, until we meet that criteria. And that's the way that you kind of combat this sort of challenge, right? Which would be, hey, the model's ready, should be out already, or this will impact our profitability if we make this decision to, let's say, move to a safer model. But if you set those guidelines up front, then you have an ability to say, no, we all agreed on this is what our corporate guidelines are for ethics of AI models. It's in violation, and it becomes very easy at that point.
Can you be more specific when you talk about corporate guidelines and ethical guidelines? Can you give us some concrete examples of this?
Here at FICO, for example, we have a model development standard, and it basically emphasizes, four major tenets of responsible AI. The first is robust AI, the second is interpretable AI, the third is ethical, and the fourth is auditable. And as part of that, there are specific algorithms that scientists are allowed to use, and there's specific procedures and tests that they need to conduct. And we actually persist all that onto the blockchain, right? So like we set those requirements before we start a model development. We know exactly what it means to build an ethical model. We know what the success criteria are. And during the model development, we go through those steps, and we have a developer, a tester, and a validator that verifies that we've made all those right steps along the way. And if we haven't, right, the model doesn't get released, right? All those criteria on the blockchain for that model development have to be met. Otherwise, we don't release model. In terms of who defines that, right, that's something that I would define from a technology perspective. We would have members of our legal team reviewing things like latent features that were learned. So essentially those relationships in the AI that's been learned so that they can look at it from a legal perspective. We have product people that can take a look at that. And so part of it is just kind of writing down, what does it mean to review a model? And literally, right, that, when you're building these models that you're concerned about ethics, you're going to look at every variable goes into the model, but moreover, you're going to look at every relationship being learned by that model and making a decision and testing that, whether or not that is ethical or not. And by going through that sort of process, you have an ability to show that, okay, we have a standard for how we do this. We can improve the standard over time, but it's not going to be different for Sally's model versus Sam's model.
And what are the outcomes that will result if an organization does not have these kinds of standards in place?
One of the major sort of outcomes is that models may go out, or AI may go out into the wild that haven't been properly tested, right? And so this sort of urgency to get a model out, right, means that this will be discovered post hoc after it's been deployed. And I think it's the very worst thing to happen, right? Or it's you put that sort of onus on, let's say, testers in production, which means that there were a period of time potentially where the model was being biased or unethical towards one group versus another. And then, what does that mean? Well, it certainly means that those that are being impacted by that model are going to be pretty unimpressed, and they should be unimpressed. And so, that is something that, organizations really need to avoid at all costs.
And ultimately, if you have bad decisions that are being made, there are real world impacts on consumers. I mean, the kind of things that the financial system has tried to weed out, like redlining neighborhoods, for example, just as one. And so you can really sort of take a rocket fueled set of steps backwards if this is not handled right.
For example, at FICO, that I emphasize, right? Like each of these, we might produce billions of scores. Each of those scores could make it have an outcome on an individual that either has a very positive impact on their life or a less positive impact on their life. And it's serious business. And so from that perspective, right, that's why these sort of processes are needed. And we also have to recognize that not everybody is suited to be an ethicist, right? So like the data scientist who's just really great at algorithms and data, right? She might need help from the rest of the organization around what is ethical or not. We can't put that on her shoulders, right? And so I think that's where companies that are really serious about using AI effectively to cause transformation, right, but also do it in a responsible and safe way, recognize that it does take an organization, not just a data science organization, to define that, but we have to put the right scaffolding and tools in place because it's not easy. I mean, we have specialized algorithms. We have, extensive reviews of models and latent features. And in fact, I have new technology that talks about how to explain, even the outcome, which is very, very different and complex. And so the amount of complexity to do this well and safely is huge. And that's why we need that sort of process. It's a team sport.
Folks who are asking questions on Twitter and LinkedIn, keep your questions coming. We're going to jump there to your questions in just a moment. But Scott, you made a comment earlier about the technology, and you didn't say this, but you implied that the technology itself is, shall we say, values neutral, meaning it's just tech. Mm-hmm. To me, that is scary. Of course, what you're saying is true, but it's also scary because it means that folks who are developing and putting the tech into practice, if they don't have sensitivity towards the ethical dimensions, you really can end up with profound problems in terms of the outcomes. And these may be very ethical and moral people, but they're just not. They're thinking about the technology separate, divorced from the impact on real people, individuals, and their credit lives and their financial lives.
AI is amazing, right? And what it can do is superhuman. And sometimes we give it godlike properties with a small g, right? But it's not that. It's just an algorithm. It's just a piece of mathematics. And I think the challenge is this, right? We sometimes focus on the wrong things. And I've had these conversations before around what are success criteria, right? And very often we'll say, well, success criteria is the highest performing model. Well, is that the success criteria? Maybe the success criteria should be that we're not going to be biased towards gender or race or ethnicity or nationality or some other sort of trait. And prediction will come second. Right. Maybe that's our second. And so just that concept, Michael, people don't talk about. Right. And maybe it could be like, hey, we don't want to harm people and we have to define what harm looks like. And so, we need to change the narrative. When we train data scientists, we train them on performance only. Right. And so, executives might see this high performing model and that's great. And when we have this really smart person that developed it and we trust her. Right. But at the same time, right, as you move away from the model developer all the way down the chain to who deploys it, you're further and further removed from how that model was built. And so we become callous, right? We become callous because we know the machine's powerful, right? And people trust the machine when, maybe that trust isn't earned.
What I find particularly interesting as well is humans, we all have our own biases. I like the color red and you like the color blue and on from there. And yet we're trying to produce these systems technology systems that do not have bias, where we're trying to weed the bias out. And that seems like a fundamental human, intellectual, mental, emotional challenge to accomplish that goal.
for example, the standards that we develop sometimes involve debate, right? So, as an example, I'll tell you, we studied this extensively, right? And we continue to study it. It's really core to our business. But you can have a very biased data set and you can run a model and you could actually get an unbiased model, right? It's not, it's not something that you always have the outcome that biased data, results in biased model, but very often it does, right? And it really depends on what that model grabs a hold of in the data. And that's where, like for us, we use these technologies called interpretable neural networks, where we actually are able to have a model architecture where we can interpret each of the latent features, and we make those latent features very simple, right? They have only two connections into any latent feature, and so it's very different than other types of technologies. But what that allows me to do, Michael, is I can go pull out that relationship, and maybe it's a relationship between, let's say, the number of collection events greater than $500 and total mortgage balance, and then we can go look at that, right? And we can debate it, right, with a group that are going to look at that relationship. We can test it statistically to see if there's differences between different groups of people, and then have that debate. And I think it is that human debate, Michael, because not one person has a full reign over what's ethical or what's not ethical, right? And I think that's part of the process. We have to have human in the loop, and we have to be having those decisions and discussions. And that's not, frankly, the only way we get better, right? Is we might say this one's fine, and then maybe a year from now, we'll decide we've changed our mind. And that's okay as long as we codify it and we continue to grow and change our perspective.
The problem is, you talk about human in the loop. Which human and what are their agendas? There are a lot of humans whose primary goal in business is to make money, and the ethical aspects, I was going to say the ethical aspects be damned, but let's not even go to that extreme. So this is another aspect, is weeding out the agendas of the policeman, so to speak.
You can't divorce yourself of ethics and company culture. And so, I think this is one of the things that, everyone needs to focus on, right? If you have a company that, it doesn't seem to have an ethics officer, it doesn't seem to have a responsible AI function and doesn't talk about it, then, that maybe can be concern, right? Versus those that, put a lot of power and stake in the concept of responsible AI, and kind of voting rights and power to have that conversation at the seat. So for sure, I mean, that, the standards will reflect culture. And if the culture is not one that kind of, focuses on safety and meeting the sort of profit along with safe and responsible use, then, that's maybe a company that you don't necessarily want to have an interaction with.
If you're listening, this would be an excellent time for you to subscribe to this CXOTalk newsletter so we can keep you up to date on our upcoming shows. Just go to CXOTalk.com and subscribe. And we're planning an entire series around AI ethics. So if this is of interest to you, subscribe to our newsletter. All right, let's go to Twitter. And Chris Peterson has been waiting very patiently. He has a question. And he says this, he's asking about FICO, but we don't want to pry into your proprietary information. So either talk about it in terms of FICO or more generally. And he says this, he says, Gen AI tends to focus on unsupervised learning. Does FICO use actual lending decisions to transform their input data into a more supervised learning model?
A lot of these generative AI technologies are supervised, right? The construction of one of these foundational models, is an unsupervised one. And then, when one wants to develop a task-based large language or generative AI result, right? That's where you kind of focus on this sort of reinforcement learning. For us today, right, we have something which we call responsible generative AI. And for, what that means, Michael, and is that, we are basically spending a tremendous amount of time on what you discussed earlier, like what is the right data to go into the model in the first place, right? These generative models. And that involves like removing a humongous amount of data, right? I don't need to know about Shakespeare when I answer a financial inclusion question, right? And so, we have an entire strategy which is around, really spending a tremendous amount of time on data curation for the specific domain we're in. And then we have work that we do around task-based models where indeed, right, to the question asked, we go from an unsupervised model, which would be like a foundational model that we develop, which we call a focused language model. We develop that in-house to these task-based models. And that would involve a supervised aspect of it, right? The goodness or badness of how that decision is being made. And moreover, we go to the third step, which is a risk-based score, right? Which would say, okay, with even all that work done, we still need a risk score, whether or not we think the output of this is safe to use and respond, high confidence. With that said, today, all our focus areas are not to use these technologies to make lending decisions, right? The technologies are not at that point, and I think many of our customers feel the same way. But that doesn't mean that we don't work to see how far we can take that technology, or maybe get to a technology that eventually will be, more safe to use for, inclusion in these sort of risk-based decisions.
So when you say that the technology is not being used for lending decisions, you create the FICO credit score that then individuals or other systems at other companies say will incorporate into their lending decisions. But you're saying that FICO is not making lending decisions or recommending lending decisions specifically. Is that what you're saying?
We certainly are not making those decisions. So yeah, we like the FICO score, we will use things like traditional AI, not generative AI, but traditional AI to find new relationships in data and combine new types of data sources. The deployment of those sort of models are using a transparent, interpretable technology. So, it's very, very safe. And then those scores then get used in other processes that where each and every individual lending institution would then decide how to use that score in conjunction with other information that they have.
I see. So the transparency aspect then is built into your internal processing.
That's correct. We're big on interpretable models. And so, one is, things like interpretable neural networks, which I'm very, very focused on. And we also have interpretability in the traditional scorecard technologies, which are, some of the technologies that we use behind the FICO score. And what it means for us, right, is that we have absolute certainty on what drove the score and what variables, and we can go and ensure that, we have that level of inspection, and also go through that entire ethical kind of review of what's driving those scores, and are we satisfied with that?
This is from Greg Walters, and this is a very broad question. And he says, how do you see America's leadership role in the global AI innovation and advancements in terms of ethics, regulations, etc.? Whose ethics gets used as training? Again, there's a number of different things in his question.
I started to really push this concept of responsible AI, I think it was in the year 2016. We've seen a lot of focus in the United States with people concerned about responsible use of AI. I've talked about these concepts of interpretable neural networks and monotonicity and the use of machine learning and other concepts that are critically important for really high stakes decisions, such as credit risk at many venues where people are really interested in using these technologies appropriately. So I think the United States will continue to be a leader in this space, because I think many of our organizations want to use the technology responsibly, and they want to, look at what are the right algorithms to do it. Part of it's education, right? They also look across the seas, right, and look at things like the EU AI Act, right, which would act to, impose sort of restrictions on use of AI. And I think, the people that I talk to in the industry, are very much focused on this ISAC sort of concept, right, where if they come together as an industry group and come up with the best practices, then they can continue to use AI, but do so in responsible ways. So, I generally see that we'll continue this sort of thought leadership in the U.S. We certainly have some of the best minds here. And I think regardless of what happens from a regulatory perspective, right, people will continue to know that, if you're making decisions in a responsible, ethical way, that pays dividends in terms of, the success of a company and that customer trust in your brand, which, cannot be underestimated.
Greg Walters also asked in his question, whose ethics gets used as training, which I think is related to a question earlier asked by Arslan Khan. So whose ethics gets used in the training?
Each company would have their own ethics, right? And this comes down to, this sort of model development standard or ethical committee. So, for example, right, when we develop models, we understand, what are the sort of regulatory things that we're going to pay attention to, right, and we have to pay attention to. But moreover, right, we will emphasize that, okay, what are those standards for how we will incorporate different types of learned relationships or not? And so, in some sense, right, that comes down to that ethics committee and that model development standard, which will indicate, for example, hey, in these learned latent features, there can be no more than a 1% difference between the protected classes, right, or different groups of individuals. That's a standard, right? That basically says, hey, we even if we might lose a little bit on prediction, right, we want to maintain that level of standard with respect to differences across classes. I think the thing that doesn't happen very often, though, Michael, and just to that point is, people aren't actively extracting these learned relationships. They're not actually putting tests around it. And that's what we do, right? If I'll extract each of those latent features and I will test them for differences between groups that we're trying to monitor for ethics around. And I set a mathematical constraint that says it passes or it doesn't. If it doesn't pass, it's excluded from the model development and we respin it, right? And this is a general problem, right? And I think it goes back to the question a little bit, right? We have a lot of regulation that we have to deal with, right? Very often it doesn't prescribe in the regulation what is it to be ethical, right? And that's each and every organization's job to define it. And if it's not defined or written down, that's a problem because that means it's non-uniformly applied. But it in the short, I believe it's each and every organization. And then if there's an ISAC concept that groups want to come together and define it as a group, right? Then that's another great place. But there's not a definition, let's say, in most regulation of when you're ethical or you're not ethical.
And Arslan Khan comes back and he says, independently, he's asking this of the question we just had that came from LinkedIn. He says, if every organization has their own corporate guidelines, wouldn't that result in every organization having their own interpretation of what is ethical? And isn't that a reason for federal/industry-wide guidelines instead?
You might have the good, the bad, and maybe some ugly in terms of what those standards are, right? I'm much more in favor of the ISAC, the industry groups coming together and defining that. Because here's the issue, right? There are certain types of models and problems that we solve with AI that we have to be hypercritically focused on ethics. And there's other types of things where you use AI where maybe you're less concerned about it, right? Maybe it's not actually impacting people. It's a different use of AI. And, a broad sort of regulation, could actually pose harm, right? And so, I think that could be an ultimate outcome, right? If there's a lot of disparity in terms of what these standards look like. But I am hoping that, organizations will come to best practices. And I can tell you that I have CAOs and others that reach out to me to ask what FICO standards are, and they'll share their standards and we learn from each other. So it's happening. It's happening kind of organically right now. I really would hope that it continues that way so that, there's not a need necessarily for government to jump in and to prescribe because they may not have every industry's sort of needs best understood, right? And that could be detrimental.
We had a member of the House of Lords as a guest on CXOTalk who wrote a book on algorithmic fairness and bias. And one of the points he made echoes something you just said, which is you need to look at the application of that AI because some issues demand greater scrutiny and potentially regulation, and others don't. And he is in the position of supporting promulgating regulation. So he was echoing what you just said as well.
If you look at take a page out of the EU AI Act, right? You have high risk and very high risk AI, and That's the other thing, frankly, that organizations really should be taking stock of right now, right? Which is, what are those sort of applications, right? And that may be job one for that ethics committee. That would be higher risk and higher impact, and which of those are lower risk? And that will change sort of the considerations from an algorithm perspective. Absolutely.
Arsalan Khan comes back again. He's asking great questions. And he says, what data should we collect that has not been collected yet to make AI more ethical? And by the way, I don't even know what it means to say to make AI more ethical.
One of the things that we should always be striving to do is have an ability to, ensure that we can do the testing that we need from an AI perspective. So, we have this sort of challenge from an industry perspective. When we develop models, very often we don't, or we may not have great information about, who the person is, what their race is, what their gender is, right? We do that, it's a colorblind view, right? So many models, you don't have all that information available, and there's some other function that would have that information available to test the model after the fact, if that testing occurs. So I think, thought being put around, like, what are the ways that we can kind of have these sort of validations that would be done, or data sets that are available to test these assumptions more efficiently would be one of those aspects. Outside of that, right, I'm a tremendous fan of interpretable machine learning. I mean, I just think that we need to get out of the mystique of the big black boxes that, have billions of weights, and get into the practical models that might have, 70 weights, produce a similar result, but we have full understanding and control. Both are, like today, right? That's one of the best paths, because we don't always have access to all that additional data. But, I do think, thinking through how we can safely share information about protected classes, and then, do that in a way that all model developers have that available, that would enable more and more people to study this as part of their regular development process.
Can you give an example of what you're talking about, how you would be able to collect that kind of data so that you can use it in a positive way, but avoid the problems that arose in the past, which is precisely why that protected data is protected and very often is not collected?
One could have a set of information that you develop a model on, and only in a protected enclave of, where you kind of upload your results, or you do your model development, do you have access to, let's say, the protected class information for testing purposes, right? And so this would be like it's almost like a blind validation that, hey, yeah, this is working effectively, right? Or, if, let's say, I surface 20 latent features that I need to test for whether or not they show any sort of differences between protected classes, load that information, allow in an algorithm essentially to attach, let's say, race and gender and other items, and then produce just for me the metric. So I don't actually ever have access to, let's say, that sensitive information from a PI perspective, but we have the algorithm developed in such a way that I can access that for the purposes of producing my metric, not for the purposes of me manipulating my model per se, or exposing that information. And I think that's around, this sort of concepts of conclaves and other, protected, places where models can then get that information for the purposes of producing the metrics, but not for the purposes of divulging that information in the development. So you continue to protect PII and privacy.
There is so much risk associated with what you're talking about, because the problem is good intentions can be diluted by bad actors acting under the guise of having good intentions.
There certainly is. And that's why, I talk about things like this conclaves, right? Where it's really like, the developers won't have access, and there has to be some sort of function that would do that in a safe and monitored way.
Can you take us through the life cycle of developing products that have ethical AI frameworks baked in?
We have a AI model development standard, right? And that standard basically says, what is the type of model that we're developing? For that type of model, what are the requirements from an ethics perspective? How do we define what is acceptable data, and ensure that we have the right coverage of that data from a different group perspective? How do we define the outcome that we're trying to predict? Have we collected enough outcome data? Is it the right outcome data? Have we validated that outcome data? And then from there, right, we prescribe essentially what are those algorithms that you're allowed to use, right? And so, for us, it's interpretable machine learning technologies where, we would go and ensure that we have the ability to interpret each and every learned latent feature. From there, right, that process then says, great, for each of those latent features, you extract it from the model development, and you go and make sure the data scientists believe that it's ethical based on the testing that they can do and the inspection. And then you'd bring that to a larger committee that involves people other than just data scientists to make those assertions. Based on that, you would basically allow or disallow certain latent features, which means you have to go into your algorithm again and say, hey, we're not allowed to use this relationship anymore, and respin it. And you continue that process over and over and over and over. So you use the machine learning as a tool, not as a solution, right, to surface these latent features until you get to a point where you've identified the model that has exposed all these latent features that you can explain and interpret, but moreover, that you've had an ethics discussion about that relationship and what the ramifications would be, and you have testing around it to show that it's ethical or not. At that point, right, you go through and have the ability to move forward with kind of demonstrating what that model would look like in terms of how it gets deployed. But moreover, what are those monitoring that you would do? So each of these latent features then also have a monitoring requirement to say if things start to go a little skew, right, the assumptions under which we developed it under, and we've shown it to be ethical, right, we have to be revisited. And that'd be kind of the life cycle of really getting into the middle of that black box. I mean, for us, it's not a black box anymore. It's a white box that we're actively, allowing or disallowing the learned relationships in. And that is kind of for us what it means to be part of that ethical process is that we're not going to be on autopilot.
It seems to me there is a built-in tension between the goals that you were just describing on the one hand, and on the other hand, the temptation for business people to kind of gently put their finger on the scale because they want a particular outcome, and they don't want data scientists telling them, hey, you can't do this. They say, no, this is what we need to do. So how do you manage that inherent tension?
Again, it's culture, right? But beyond culture, right, it's that AI model development standard. So, this is one of the reasons I use blockchain, right? Because let's say you're the business person that wants to put his thumb on the scale, and I'm the data scientist who wants to stick to, what I believe to be ethical. Before we even start the build, Michael, you and I would agree, right? We'd say, okay, the success criteria is a 15% lift in detection of, default. Okay, we agree on that. And then we'd say, hey, we're going to say that there can be no more than 2% difference between how the latent features treat one group of people versus another group of people. And we'll say, do we agree on that, Michael? And we do. Okay, that's put on the blockchain. At that point, we can't take it off the blockchain, right? And so we've agreed on that up front. Now, later on in the process, if one of my latent features is, let's say very highly performing, make us a lot of money, right? But it violates it. Let's say it's 3% difference between African-American, Black, and white Caucasian, right? That's not an opportunity for you to say, listen, the money's too attractive to me, because we agreed up front that was, what our criteria was. And so at that point, we'd have to remove it, right? And I think this is the sort of, things like AI auditability and things like blockchain, we use it to hold people accountable. So if you and I agreed on what the standard was up front, and it's aligned with, let's say, our corporate standard for the company that we are both employed at, later on, we're not going to have that, right? It would be a clear violation of what was sort of established, right? And then, we don't have that sort of like, come on, Scott, just look past this, right? For the sake of the company or the sake of the profit. And, at the end of the day, though, Michael, right, as much as that's a real concern, I also have seen in my practice is that, ethics can be met while having tremendously high performance models, right? Because like if AI model finds something that's questionable, and I disallow it, AI is great. It'll go find another relationship, and it might be just as good, right? Maybe even better, and not have that ethical concern. So very often it's not this sort of like, we have a much, much less profitable model, but it's ethical. It's more like, hey, we have a similar profit, and And this one is one that we can feel good about. And that's really what everyone should be striving for.
So you use the blockchain as a form of indelible ink, so to speak.
It's an enforcement tool. Yeah, it's an enforcement tool of a standard. And I think, this really, and this is why I talk about it as a corporate sort of thing, right? It's something that everyone needs to agree with up front, but, most will, right? And that's where we get, frankly, Michael, from do no evil sort of mantras to like, no, that we can agree on that, right? But we're going to show no evil, right? And prove no evil, right? And indeed, it's an indelible ink, it's immutable. And, organizations that take that approach, right, you can have a lot of confidence in because, they themselves are holding themselves accountable. They don't necessarily need the regulators to hold them accountable. They don't necessarily need the customers to hold them accountable. Like they're holding themselves accountable. And frankly, again, there's usually a happy outcome where you can do both, right? You can meet your business objectives and you can do it in a responsible way. You just have to make that, to the earlier part of the conversation, make that one of the top success criteria. Not something you think about after the fact, which is what happens very often in some shops.
Elizabeth Shaw has a question that I think you just answered, which is, how do you balance the profit motive against the ethical use of AI decisions?
We put up front from a corporate perspective what both expectations are. And, one of the beautiful things about like what we use with blockchain is literally the model can't be released unless all those pre-agreed success criteria are met. And so if they're not met, well, you go back to the drawing board. And that might be, we're going to have to accept lower profit because we don't want to be unethical or uncomfortable with that, right?
So there's a cultural dimension, which you alluded to, and Arsalan Khan comes back again and says, will AI change culture or will culture change AI? And any tips?
I think culture will change AI. And I certainly hope so, right? My tips would be, frankly, that we need to make sure that the human is in the loop, right? One of my biggest fears is that we get so enamored with things like, generative AI and large language models that, we give them more credibility than they really deserve, right? And we don't want to lose that human in the loop. So, I think for our own well-being as human beings on this planet, we need to assert our control and partner with AI as a tool. And I think that's probably going to be the right sort of outcome in terms of how both will kind of coexist peacefully and profitably and productively, right? And solving some of the world's biggest challenges too. In addition to that, beyond profit, right? Like safety and health and prosperity and other things that we as humans care about.
Greg Walters comes back on LinkedIn and says, the blockchain is a great implementation, very interesting. He's wondering if this is an AI and training standard. Are there other people using blockchain for this purpose you described?
There's not a lot of people using blockchain, right? There are people that are keeping track of the model development. They have checkpoints in place. There are people that are trying to implement it through database structures. But with that said, I'm seeing more and more interest in use of blockchain and AI. In fact, there was an article that came out earlier in the year or last year about AI and blockchain maybe being really the perfect pair to ensure that models are built ethically. And so, we feel so strongly about it that we're using it across our entire AI decisioning platform that we develop here at FICO, not just models, but the entire sort of decisioning process. And so I think we're going to see more and more sort of adoption of blockchain for that purpose. And moreover, right, looking ahead, right, as we look at things like agent-based AI, same thing. Blockchain is going to help produce, some sort of guardrails for these technologies. But the companies that are driving a responsible AI programs don't all use blockchain, but they have similar sort of concepts around these sort of checks and balances. The biggest part of it for me, though, right, is this concept of immutability or unchangeability, right? We just can't change the agreement, let's say that you and I had, Michael, around what is ethical or not when we build our model, right? And if we can demonstrate that through other technology, well, the task has been met. But for me, the blockchain has been a tremendous tool because it's already purpose-built for that.
Correct me if I'm wrong. It seems to me that in this decision to use blockchain in this way, you are addressing the fundamental inbuilt kinds of bias that we as people have, in this case, the bias to want what we want and to say, well, we didn't really mean it back then. So we can change what we decided up front.
We should spend a huge amount of time on defining what success looks like, what's the value proposition, what's ethical, even before we start that model development, so that we don't do that in a lazy way or a careless way, and then we actually haven't gone through that exercise. And that's why these standards are so important, right? Beyond that, maybe I'll bring up just one other point about it, right? People might be hearing this and saying, hey, this causes us to be less inventive, right? What I've seen, and we use it at FICO, right, for all the model developments, right? A few really great things happen. One is, you're following that standard, and that's important for a company to have confidence that the data science organizations and development organizations are following the standard. Two, there's a lot less mistakes, right? Because, there's not Sam's view of ethics versus Sally's, or Sam wants to use this sort of technology versus someone else uses another technology. And then you ask a poor governance team to try to figure it out, and they don't know anything about either one of the technologies, right? So organizations get more efficient, quality goes way up, standards are met from an ethics perspective. And then frankly, all that data science, creativity, and research and development goes into, what's next, right? And I think it actually is a great way to enable teams to be even more efficient and effective, right? In some sense, right? Research should not be at the cost of, decisions made on humans. Research should be done in safe, protected ways, and then, brought into an improved process down the road. And so, very much it's around, this challenge that most organizations have, like, how do you operationalize AI? And part of it is this is hard technology. You have all the ethics issues that you have to meet, all the regulatory issues you have to meet, but you also have deployment issues and expertise in the technology. There's just a tremendous amount of benefit there. And frankly, it's something that's lacking. Many data science organizations, if they don't have these sort of processes and standards in place, they're not going to be, have a flywheel of producing high quality, highly ethical models at scale. And that's what every organization wants to strive to be, right?
Question from Twitter. Can you repeat she says she thinks the 5-step framework that you described at the beginning?
If I remember that piece of it, it was, around responsible AI. There's 4 major components. There's robust AI, which is essentially how you develop models appropriately, doing all the work on data, ensuring that you have representative data, the right sort of tag data, you have stability and robustness testing in place, and you take, not hours, but maybe weeks or months to develop a model appropriately and carefully, right? That's one. 2 is interpretable AI or explainable, but we focus on interpretable AI. Understand each and every relationship that's learned so that you can express that as the reasons or outcomes related to that score. The third one is around ethical AI, right? It's its own pillar. You need to define what that means for an organization. You have to have your tests in place. You have to have your processes in place. And then the fourth piece is auditable, which, for me is around blockchain and having the ability to go back and understand in an immutable way every step that was taken, every decision that was made, and who made those decisions. And moreover, to open that blockchain up to people that need to see it, right? To see the actual truth of how that development occurred so that there's full transparency, right? In terms of how that was developed. For us, that encapsulates the sort of the 4 broad tenets of responsible AI.
Finally, another question from Twitter. If the average CXO tenure is 3 years, wouldn't you have to rediscuss what AI can do with new leadership? And should this be done with based on low-hanging fruit or with a big bang?
I would suggest go and find out what the best practices are from organizations that are willing to share it, and many are, around what their standards are. And then, adopt that as, one of the options, right? And then evolve it yourself while you're there in that role, that CXO role. And, I think it's all about starting that standard, maintaining that standard. And if you move from CXO to CXO, right, then you can go point back to what that standard is and not have to redevelop it or rediscover it. But fortunately, there's so much passion around this that I do think that many are very, very happy, like I am, to talk about what's done and what are the best practices there. And so you can get a starting point by talking to those that in the industry who you might respect, that you believe is doing it well, and find out what you can replicate.
Under the wire here, Arsalan Khan comes back again. Should we have a CMMI type levels for whether AI is ethical or not? And for people who don't know, CMMI, it's basically stages of maturity for software development.
It certainly couldn't hurt. I think we're at the very early stages of that maturity. And so like having that grading system in place, I think could be very helpful, right? In terms of setting that establishment up front. I do bemoan very often that, in software development, there's very high standards, right, for how software gets developed, but in machine learning or AI development, less so. So I do like the idea that I'd have to think about it some more, but anything that kind of grades and establishes maturity is going to be a great thing.
You're basically talking about standards at that point.
Yeah.
And with that, we are out of time. A huge thank you to Scott Zoldi. Scott, thank you for coming back again on CXOTalk and sharing your great expertise and insight with us. I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you, Michael.
And thank you to everybody who was watching, especially you folks who asked these great questions. You guys are so smart. Before you go, subscribe to our newsletter. Go to CXOTalk.com to check out our upcoming shows. We have extraordinary shows coming up. We're planning a whole series around AI ethics, so tell your friends and tell your family. And subscribe to our YouTube channel. Tune in next time. We'll see you again next week. Have a great day, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.